what was the first time you actually noticed guitar as opposed to just liking a song or a band?
I don't know. I've, in all these years, I've never been asked that. Um, when did I first notice guitar? Thinking back, it was probably something like Trini Lopez on TV. I have a memory of Trini Lopez, and I don't know from where. What shows were on in the early 60s? So, early 60s, maybe Ed Sullivan, or did we have that stuff here? I don't even know. Or Bandstand, or man, that's another therapy session. Just hang on, I'll make a phone call. I don't know. Trini Lopez came into my head. I don't know why.
What was your first real guitar?
Oh, it was a late 50s Telecaster um, that my dad bought. We went to see it, but it was bought through the Trading Post, which was a magazine. I guess you had it down here in Sydney, and we bought the Telecaster plus an amplifier for $35. So that was the first real guitar I had, and it was a great guitar. It served me really well, um, and that became one of the first guitars I destroyed through modifying it. There was a whole series after that. Yeah.
Did you have guitar lessons?
Oh yeah. Um, I started guitar lessons at school. I went to Morris Brothers, and I was fortunate to have a couple of really good teachers in amongst the maybe not so good teachers. And one of them, Brother Edward, was a guitar player, and he taught me some really basic stuff, and it was great. He was a great guy, really good to have as a first teacher, and I soon outgrew him because I had a voracious appetite for learning, and then I started private lessons outside of school. I was 9. Mm.
What was the most important thing that you learned when you were learning guitar?
Back then, when I was 9, 10, what was the most important thing? Um, Chords. That's also a good question. Chords. I learnt to play chords and rhythm, and I guess my first um, my first um, feelings about playing guitar were to support the song, because I played rhythm. I certainly didn't learn any lead stuff. It was all rhythm and E, A, D.
When did you first become aware of tone?
Ooh, tone. Wasn't when I was playing acoustic guitar right at the very beginning. I had no awareness of tone. Um, I think the first time I heard a guitar sound that made me stop was Doug Ford. Probably the guitar sound in Turn Up Your Radio. That amazing thing that he does with the A chord, which to this day I still can't do. Um, I think that's the first time I was aware of sound, tone. I didn't have a word for it. We didn't. I don't think we spoke about tone back then. But but I do remember hearing that sound and being shocked. Wow, that does something to me. Yeah, that probably Doug Ford. Even though I liked Led Zeppelin and Free and Deep Purple and all that stuff, um, that I don't recall thinking about the tone of any of those things. But that guitar sound that Doug Ford had on 510 Man and Turn Up Your Radio, that did something to me. It still does to this day.
Let's talk about Paul Kossoff.
It's a rather dusty Paul Kossoff. Paul Kossoff needs to be cleaned.
When did you first hear Paul Kossoff?
And Paul Rogers. I first heard Paul Kossoff when All Right Now was released, and I have a clear memory of going to a friend's place by the name of Larry Phillips, who lived in the same road as we did in Malabar in Sydney, and he played the entire Fire and Water album, and I remember being stuck in the lounge chair in front of the stereo speakers. Just, I'm like, what's this? Oh my God! And that really hit me, and that was obviously Paul Kossoff, and that huge effect on me. And in May, I think it was May 9th, I'm not sure, of 1971, I saw Free with Deep Purple at the Randwick Racecourse, and it was huge. These four little guys, it was just enormous. We now talk about the space and the pregnant pauses. It was massive. That was a seminal experience for me, and to this day it remains I think it's a clear memory. It's a long while ago, but I also have the bootleg, and my memories are correct. And I have photos from the day. A huge day for me, and Kossoff's playing to this day remains a monolith on the landscape.
At what point did you start investigating his gear and his tone?
Well, you couldn't investigate his gear. Back then, if you were lucky, you saved up and bought an NME or Melody Maker, which came out however many months late. We received them months late, and if you were lucky, you got a photo, and you checked out everything you could on the photo. To the extent of back then, we're trying to look at what numbers the amp controls were on. Everything. We had nothing back then, so all I had was the occasional photo, and you might get a photo on an album, and now we know that those things are just snapshots of a point in time. They don't necessarily reflect everything that was going on. That's all we had. So, he's using a Les Paul, and it looks like it's got funny colour, I think, so sunburst. And that's a Marshall, and Marshall quad boxes. And so I became aware of Marshall and Les Paul around that stage. We had very, very limited access to knowledge. All we had was a pair of ears. So it looked like Les Paul. What sort of Les Paul? Nobody knew. It was just shaped like a Les Paul. Marshall. What Marshall? No one knew. Oh, it's a Marshall speaker cabinet. There must be Marshall speakers, which of course, we now know to be not true. There are no Marshall speakers, and we now know that there are 100 different types of Marshall amplifiers, and even back then there were maybe not 100 back then, but there was a variety of amps, and they were also being tweaked by something called a technician. We didn't know what that was either, so it was all very mysterious.
Yeah. Mick Ralphs?
Love Mick Ralphs. Wasn't really aware of him he doesn't get spoken about enough. I wasn't really aware of him in Mott the Hoople, but I certainly became aware of him in Bad Company, and I love that gritty, mid-rangey, distorted guitar sound. It's fantastic, and he again a very underrated player. Couldn't play a solo to save his life, but a really appropriate. I don't mean that in a dismissive way. A really appropriate rhythm player. Got the right sounds, I think, for the songs, and played well. Played with a good groove. Very underrated guitar player. He never gets mentioned, but he had a big influence on me.
Pete Townsend.
Oh, huge influence. Huge. Um, in my opinion, the greatest rhythm guitar player. Um, to this day, he remains a huge influence on my rhythm playing, and it, also later I realised that his playing wasn't cookie cutter, um, and by that I mean the rhythm parts that he played for a song were, um, yeah, it's the rhythm part for the song, but he didn't play them the same through all the verses or all the choruses, unlike other bands like for example, AC/DC and the Angels, and even Free. The rhythm guitar parts, you listen to live stuff and it's pretty close to what it was on the recording, and verse one is pretty much the same as verse two. But with Townsend, I realised that there's the rhythm guitar part, but he's also he also takes certain liberties, a lot of liberties with his rhythm guitar parts, which marry with Keith Moon and John Entwistle, and it's all this kind of it's all doing this, but it's all moving forward. And Townsend's just the absolute king at that, and to this day, he remains a huge influence. And his guitar sound, something about that snap at the very beginning of the note, which is the bit of the note that I'm most interested in. I'm not really interested in sustain. It's that first bit of the note that you hear that interests me, and that's something very obvious about Townsend's sound. It's that thing at the beginning, and the rest of it, doesn't really matter. It's that beginning of the note. That is a huge thing for me still.
We've spoken about some international players that influenced you. Who were some local players that you looked up to back in the day?
I never got to see Doug Ford at a gig, but he, you know, Doug Ford is the king. Um, but people who I saw, Kevin Borich, I saw Billy Green from Doug Parkinson's band. I saw Tim Gaze a number of times. I saw Borich a lot of times because my band played with him. So Kevin, Tim Gaze, who's a beautiful, beautiful player, Billy Green. I saw Dennis Wilson in Carver's Jute. Um, they're the guys that really stand out. And I was lucky enough to be able to see them as close as you are, which unfortunately younger players nowadays, they don't get to do that. They don't have that. Well, we didn't think it was a luxury. We thought it was pretty normal. There's Norm Rue from Band of Light. He's right there. Now people go to a gig and there's a screen a couple of 100 metres away, and somewhere in the distance are dots, and there's people in the band. But I was lucky enough to see my heroes. Norm Rue was a big influence on me. Um, in the very early days, John Baxter from Buffalo had that kind of grotesque, distorted guitar sound, which I liked. I didn't go for it myself. There were a lot of good players that I got to see close up, local players. They had a big influence on me because they were good players, and because I could see them right there, and things that you can see right in front of you influence you.